it's weird, but I almost feel sometimes like a piece is telling me what to do with it rather than I'm deciding what it's going to become, if that makes sense. Like, I really do believe that every book or every poem has its own energy. It has its own, it's like, it has its own way it wants to come into the world. And so, yes, it's going to come through your filter as a writer. It's going to come through your style and the language that you prefer to use. But sometimes it just goes to places where you couldn't have planned. Like, I don't know if you ever find that. If you look at things you've written and you think, how did I come up with this? But if you don't know, if you don't know to look for those things, and you do think that poetry is only academic and it's very dry and it's something that you learn in high school, and you don't like it because you had a really boring English teacher in high school, then yes, you're always going to have this block with it. But if you can open it up to it and take the time to find those other people who are using it in ways that go against a lot of those traditional ideas of poetry, it can be really interesting.
Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello, Reflectives, and welcome to episode 386 of the Stark Reflections podcast. This is your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre. In today's episode, I have an interview with Liz Worth. Liz is a poet, a novelist, and a nonfiction writer. She's a two-time nominee for the Relit Award for Poetry for her books The Truth is Told Better This Way and No Work Finished Here, Rewriting Andy Warhol. Her first book, Treat Me Like Dirt, was the first of its kind to provide an in-depth history of Southern Ontario's first wave punk movement. Her new poetry book, Inside Every Dream, A Raging Sea, is now published through Book Hug Press, just came out in late October, and we talk a lot about that new book Liz is writing, as well as metaphysical things, including a little bit of the tarot. If any of you are longtime listeners, you may remember that Liz was a guest back in episode 287, and the title for that episode was Vulnerability in Writing, Performance Art, and Tarot Readings. And it was so great to get a chance to chat with Liz about her new book, just in time. See, the Halloween season doesn't ever really end for me, but it is, still the Halloween season as you're getting this, or it's just ending as this episode is released. But it is a wonderful conversation, and I know you're going to enjoy it. I am going to forego a lot of the introductory matter just because it has been absolutely batshit crazy for me in October. This has been incredible with travel and book events and all the things going on. So many personal updates to share with you and stuff like that. But all I want to do is just to say thank you so much, listeners, for hanging in with me over these last several weeks, as my episodes were not necessarily interviews, but just my reflections from the road. And I've gotten some great feedback from several folks about that. And I'll include that in future episodes, like the comments I've gotten and stuff like that. But I'm glad that those rambling reflections from the road have been resonating with you, to try to go with alliteration there. And I just want to say a huge thank you to all my listeners for being there, as well as to all of those who support this podcast over at patreon.com/starkreflections, as well as to those coffee buddies of mine over at buymeacoffee.com/markleslie. Your support means so much to me, and your support in listening means so much to me. But I am going to forego the normal personal update and all that stuff, so we can get right into the interview, because again, I'm on another deadline to get to another conference, and boy, are my arms tired. No, wait, that's a different joke. I am just so exhausted and hoping to have it's funny, I get back from this conference and then I'm going to be on my way to Vegas, but at least I have a few days in between, and hopefully I can get caught up and get some of these other great interviews I have in the queue. I have more coming up. It's so exciting. So many wonderful people I meet. I get to get their perspective and get to share that. I'm privileged that I get to share that with you, dear listener. And speaking of sharing with you, I'm going to roll that bumper and we're going to get into this wonderful conversation I had with Liz Worth just a few weeks ago. Hey, Liz, welcome back to the Stark Reflections podcast.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me again.
Oh, it's great to chat with you again. I'm really excited. We're going to be talking about, so October 22nd, 2024, you're releasing a new book
Hmm.
of poetry because you've
Yes.
written other kinds of books.
Yes.
Let's first talk a little bit about that. So we have Inside Every Dream, A Raging Sea,
Hmm.
which is a book of poetry, but it's based on ritual. It's based on sort of parts of it, based on tarot, based on sort of other elements and themes. What is Inside Every Dream, A Raging Sea? Besides, and I know it's one of the poems in the collection.
Yeah. Yeah. So this book is really based off of an idea that I've been working with for a long time now around the crossover between spell writing and poetry, and how both of them can operate as incantations, and both forms of writing require us to be very specific with our words. So if you ever look at spell books, books on magic, every word in an incantation or an intention that you're setting is going to be so particular, because you have to be thinking of what you're putting your energy behind
Right.
within that spell. And so poetry is the same. Every word counts, every line counts. There's not a lot of room for tangential energy to go on, or for confusion or lack of focus. And so I always think that there is a similarity between them. So I was playing with that idea when I was writing this.
Wow, and it's so amazing because I did a significant amount of research about incantations for Hex in the City, one of my novels that involves some
Yeah.
witchcraft and other sort of magic that I kind of made up. That wasn't real stuff, but I was trying to base it on real incantations and spells. So I purchased a whole bunch of books. And oh my God, you're so right. There is such a very specificity. Did I say
Mhm.
that right?
Yeah, yeah.
with a poem because it's usually very you're very cautious in terms of the word placement and how you line them up and what effects and what impact the way you present them is going to be. I never thought of it that way. That is so fascinating. Wow.
Hmm.
And yeah,
Hmm.
and if you step out of line, either way, it's going to go right off into the not to what you really want it to be, which is I
That's
love
right.
that. I love that conciseness, that very preciseness, I should say.
Yeah. And when you're talking about your creative flair that you added with your writing and your book in approaching this idea of spells and incantations, I think too it's important to remember that all of these things are made up.
Right.
Right? Every book on magic and witchcraft came from somewhere. It came from someone. Someone had to sit down and write that. And occultism has a whole history of people being very inventive and very creative in the systems that they're putting out there. Have you ever tried to put any of that work that you wrote into action as a spell?
No, I was too scared. I was a little bit
It'd
too
be an
scared.
interesting experiment.
Yeah, I know, but I get really frightened with stuff like that. I mean, there are a few incidents with the Ouija boards when I was younger, and I'm like, no,
Oh,
no, I'm done.
oh yeah.
This isn't fool around territory for me anymore. But again, I admire that creativity because one of the other things we were mentioning in conversation before this was talking about how there is a link because when I had you on last, we talked a lot about tarot, and right, and the
Mhm.
work that you do with tarot and teaching other people tarot. But there's a link between tarot and creative writing, and we talked about it a little
Yeah.
bit, but I think it's worth digging back into that because you've got all of these tendrils, different
Mhm.
aspects of creativity in your life that lead to nonfiction, that lead to fiction, that lead to poetry. Wow,
Mhm.
let's talk about that a little bit.
Mhm. Yeah, I think what we talked about last time is how when you're working with something like tarot, or any type of divination, it's very similar to writing because you are following some kind of instinct and you are following some kind of intuition. And when people talk about intuition, I think where they get confused, and I see this a lot in the tarot world, is people think that intuition just means blurting out whatever comes to you.
Mm,
And as writers, we know that that doesn't often work as much as we might want it to when we're sitting down and trying to craft a story or a poem or an essay, whatever it is we're putting together. We have an idea in our head, but we have to figure out how to translate this into something that is relevant, that's accessible, that makes sense. It's the same thing when you are delivering a tarot reading for someone else. You have to really work within the structure and framework of what you're seeing in the system of the cards. And yes, you are bringing your own intuition and your own style to it, but you're also working within something that does have some structure and does have some kind of craft to it. And writing is the same, right?
yeah,
If you write a novel, it helps to know a little bit about novel structure, even if you want to be really experimental. You have to know the rules before you break them,
right, right.
right? And so divination is very similar in that way. And so there's always this feeling of taking a leap of faith with what you're about to say.
Right.
But you also have to come from a very grounded place with it and understand why you're saying what you're saying.
Okay. Well,
Hmm.
so let's flip that back into this new book of poetry. So you said you had been chewing on the idea or kicking around the idea of the comparison between poetry and incantations, and I'm curious about when and how the poems came to you. Was it in the midst of different activities? And did you know this was going to be a book? At what point did you know this was going to be a collection as opposed to, and I know some of the poems were previously published as well. So let's explore that a little bit.
Yeah, that's a good question. I wasn't really actually aware that I was writing a collection when I was working on these. A lot of these poems were written, I'd say during deep COVID when a lot of things were closed,
Right.
and there was a lot for me. There was a lot going on because my mother was she was living with dementia. She was in her last couple of years of her life, so I was also dealing with that, and I was thinking a lot about her because she was very influential in terms of how I see the world. She was a very superstitious person. She, I would say, was a magical thinker. She had a lot of little belief systems. She was really into getting readings and would take me to psychic fairs and things like that. So when people ask me, like, how did you become a tarot reader? I was only, I was just kind of always in my life, right? And so I was thinking about her and thinking about how she was, on transitioning off of the earth um, and just yeah, thinking about certain things that she taught me or helped to shape my thinking and perspective in certain ways. And because there wasn't a lot to do at this time, I would just go for a lot of walks and wander around. And as I would walk, there's certain lines and ideas would come to me, and I would go home and write them down. And I had a notebook that I'd actually found on a curb. Someone had put it out, yeah, with a box of books. It was an empty notebook, and I
Oh,
had taken
wow.
it home one day, and I got to the end of the notebook, and I realized I had filled it with all of these poems, and I wasn't even really aware that I was
Right.
writing that much. I thought I wasn't really writing very much at all at the time, and when I started to read them back, I thought, okay, there's some interesting stuff in here, and so I started to just collect everything together and see how it all connected.
Interesting. I know as I was reading through, one of the earlier poems in the book you talk about we walked, and you even mentioned that within that like the sort of meta reference. Obviously, this is probably a poem you wrote after taking because that was something we did a lot of, right? It was like, well, we can't go anywhere and do things. So I know in my neighborhood because my window overlooks the front street
Mhm.
is the number of people going for walks because they needed to just get out of the house. And then,
Yes.
and then you would see someone on the sidewalk and then you cross the street so you could keep that social distance that was required, right? The 2 meters here in Canada, 6 feet in the US.
Yes. And I think most of my writing actually happens when I'm out walking.
Yeah.
It's not me sitting down at my laptop saying I'm going to sit down and write something right now. Usually it's when I'm doing other things and I get these
Right.
ideas, and then I come back and I just sort of record whatever came to me
Okay.
later on. But I
You,
always tell
you
people
write it
that
down
too.
afterwards, right? You don't
Yeah.
dictate while you're walking, is it?
No, I mean, I guess I could. I've never thought about that, but I sometimes I might put something in my notes app on my phone really quickly. But I'm not really a big phone person, so I don't always bring my phone when I'm out because
Yeah.
I don't know. I like to just get away from it all.
Be in the moment, right? And
Yeah,
actually experience
exactly.
it. Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, but I don't know. I always talk about that with people because and I'm sure you get this too when you're a writer. People ask how do you actually get a book written, or where do your ideas come from and what's your process? And I'm like, I honestly just I think when you're not trying to force it is how things start to come to you.
Right, right.
Mhm.
Is it fair to say you're painting pictures with words that are based on visual things you see, things you feel, experience, the emotions that run through? Is that all those things are different brushes that you're using when you finally lay those words out?
I think so. I mean, I don't always know though, because sometimes I think that it sounds weird, but I almost feel sometimes like a piece is telling me what to do with it rather than I'm deciding what it's going to become, if that makes sense. Like I
Okay,
really do believe that every piece of energy or sorry, every book or every poem has its own energy. It has its own, it's like it has its own way it wants to come into the world.
right.
And so yes, it's going to come through your filter as a writer. It's going to come through your style and the language that you prefer to use. But sometimes it just goes to places where you couldn't have planned. Like I don't know if you ever find that if you look at things you've written and you think, how did I come up with this?
Yeah. And it may not always be the thing you thought it was going to be until you sat
Exactly.
down and it had a life of its own.
Exactly. Yeah.
Are there any poems that you remember starting that may have been a poem, but then you worked it into something else later on, or did it just be was it just something in a journal? Like when you go back to the journal and you're putting things together, you're like, it's a poem here, but I think this is really something else.
That's an interesting question. I've definitely had lines like that have ended up in my novels.
Right.
Yeah, just because sometimes they feel like they want to be a little bit more than that, or they give me ideas for whole scenes or whole chapters or things that a character might be thinking or feeling. So yeah, I've certainly had that. I've also had poems that just didn't really amount to what I wanted them to be. And I think that's also common. And it doesn't mean that they can't become something eventually. But I think when you're trying to work also conceptually, if you're thinking, say, kind of poem also double as a spell, for me at least, I find when you're writing from a place that's more esoteric or more steeped in occultism, it's really, really hard not to get too cheesy with it, unless that's what you're going for,
Right.
right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
so sometimes, in experimenting with those two forms together, I've had to pull back a bit and say, I think this is getting a little bit too much for me. Maybe I can finesse it later, but yeah.
What's interesting, I mean, I could see in some of the poems there were definitely elements that came from the occult or that were related to magic or magical moments, but it
Mhm.
was very subtle. Had you
Mm.
not mentioned that, I wonder how many people would even pick up on that.
Oh, interesting. I
Yeah.
think, I think sometimes people, if they're used to thinking of a certain way, they see your references. If, right, you know what I
Of
mean?
course. So if they know your
Yeah.
background and your biography, then they're going to apply that, I guess.
Yes, yes, exactly, exactly. Because I've wondered that too, and you never know what someone's going to take from a book, right? Whether
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
poetry, whether it's a novel. Sometimes people read things that I've written and they get something completely different out of it.
Yeah.
And and I'm not always sure how they got there with it. But I mean, I've had people come up to me and talk about past poetry books that I've written, and they said, "Oh, I love this because it reminds me of tarot, even though it has no mention of tarot in it at all."
Yeah.
So Again, you never know. I like I said, I think sometimes things are coming through your filter, and people are going to they're going to see what you're implying. You don't always have to be literal or obvious about it.
Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about the mechanics. So
Mhm.
in other discussion, you had mentioned that people typically shy away from poetry. Poetry can be very intimidating. A lot of people go, "Oh, I'm not smart enough to read poetry," or it feels like it's not necessarily something easy. Maybe because of the way some people were taught in school, and it just seemed so hard. But you say that there's been a growing interest in horror adjacent poetry right now. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's just something that I've noticed that it seems to be that the horror community is, I've noticed the last few years is really latching on to poetry, and you see more space for poets to come out alongside horror authors, and it's really interesting, and it's interesting too to see people taking poetry in that direction.
Mhm.
Because horror is, to me, is always one of the most exciting genres because you can do so much with it, right? It's a really, there's no, there's no rules when it comes to horror. And there's no limits to your imagination. And poetry can sometimes feel like it is limiting because it is so focused on form and language. But now, I'm noticing, say, authors like Tiff Morris, who are doing really interesting things in blending those genres, and or Stephanie Whiteovich. And I think that again, there's also something with the horror community that's often very enthusiastic, right? And open because it is a genre that is so sprawling.
Right.
And so yeah, it's been an interesting thing to watch. I don't know if it's going to become, if poetry will ever become, big overnight sensation, like a lot of poets probably want it to be. But I do think that people are finding new avenues for it that takes it away from that feeling that it has to be really academic or it has to be
Mm,
very literary. And that's, there's always been opportunity for breakaways from that, right? When
right.
you think about poets like Allen Ginsberg, for example,
Yeah.
who was very, really, really rebellious energy for the time,
Yeah.
or someone like Patti Smith or Lydia Lunch, right? There's always that punk rock element to it and that fringe element to it.
Mhm.
But if you don't know, if you don't know to look for those things, and you do think that poetry is only academic and it's very
Right.
dry and it's something that you learn in high school, and you don't like it because you had a really boring English teacher in high school, then yes, you're always
Yeah.
going to have this block with it. But if you can open it up to it and take the time to find those other people who are using it in ways that go against a lot of those traditional ideas of poetry, it can be really interesting.
It's so funny that we're talking about that or thinking about that right now because I've just released the 20th anniversary of the first book I put together, which was a collection of short stories and dark and horror poetry. I
Mm.
have written poetry outside of horror and darkness and dark humor, but it was so funny as I was putting this together and wanting to add pieces I've published in the last 20 years. One of the things I recognized is I haven't written a lot of horror in maybe the last 10 years or so. And I definitely haven't written much poetry since then, even though I did
Mm.
I had to write a poem called 20 Haunting Years as a sort of a reflection
Ah,
of
yes.
this writer's life. But it was so interesting because as I was doing that, I felt I felt a connection to my earlier self, but I also felt a connection to a part of myself I haven't looked at in a while,
Mm.
which is interesting because poetry for me has allowed me to, I guess, tap into something different, tap into something that it kind of wakens a different part of me. I don't know what it is.
Mm.
I often used to write poetry as a warm-up exercise just to get these creative juices flowing, and then I would move into prose, which is a different form
Interesting.
almost.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
so that is so fascinating. So you had this collection. How did the book happen? Was it a publisher that you knew? Was it, did you put together, did you pitch the idea of what it was going to be? Did you just submit all the poems together? How did that work? What's the logistical process there?
Yeah, I just put all the poems together and put them in an order that I felt had a good flow. And then I sent them to a publisher I've worked with before, Book Hug Press, which is an amazing, innovative Canadian poetry publisher. And they also do fiction and translations as well. And they've done my last two poetry books, and they were into what I sent them, and so we've just gone from there, which is
Okay,
great
cool.
because I always enjoy working with them, and I love all the books that they do because they really put things out that you might not be seeing otherwise. So it's
Yeah.
always exciting. Yeah, and so that's how it came about. I don't know. I was Someone asked me this the other day. I was joking about it, where I thought I must be really confident with this book because I didn't send it to anybody. I just sent it. I put it together. I didn't ask anyone to read it. I didn't have a beta reader. I just thought this feels good to me, and I sent it off. And then when I was doing the acknowledgments for it, I was like, I'm not even sure who I should thank,
Oh,
which
like
is
who?
it's
No,
such a
who
weird.
read it
Yeah,
prior
who read
to?
it? Thank you.
Yeah.
I was like, I don't know. It's all me this time. So hopefully people like
Yeah. Well, but
it.
I think you had already done a couple books of poetry with this
Yeah.
publisher, so you already knew that you had a connection, that they obviously you worked well with them in the past. So with the
Mhm.
editorial process, how I'm curious about how heavy-handed or how light that was.
Yeah, it's a good question. I did work with an editor on the book once it was kind of getting ready to move,
Yeah,
move
yeah,
towards printing, move towards copy editing, all of that. It was Jennifer Lovegrove, who's also an amazing writer, and it's I've always found the editing process is never too heavy at this point in time
right,
because
yeah,
I think that we all would love to have someone, or at least maybe not everybody would love it, but I think there is this idea in traditional publishing that once a publisher takes on a book, that they're going to make it their own somehow. But the reality is that usually by the time they're saying yes to that book, the book is probably 90% there. They're not going to take something on that needs a huge amount of work because it's so competitive to get a book published.
yeah,
Right. So your manuscript has to be really, really ready to go, I find. And so really when you're at that point, it's being so nitpicky about things. It's looking at, is the order of the poems the best order it could be? Should we move some things around? It's looking line by line and saying, are there other words we could be using?
right,
One thing I'm aware of that I do as a writer is I sometimes use the same words too often. And in
mhm,
poetry, that stands out a lot.
yeah,
Right. And so that's the stuff that I was really looking for. It's like how many times am I saying, do I need to change up the language or
yeah,
be a little bit fresher from one piece to the next in case someone is sitting down and reading these cover to cover, right?
yeah.
So it's really looking at things like that when you're doing a poetry collection. And yeah, it's like I said, it's very nitty gritty looking at is this the right word for this? Is this the right image? Do we need to expand on something to make it feel less abstract so that it's more accessible for the reader?
And is this potentially the right order? Because maybe
Yeah,
the impact of this story, we need to place this other one between these two because,
that's
it's
right.
there's a flow.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah,
And what are we opening with, right? Like what's going to
yeah,
be the one to really
yeah.
pull someone in? Yeah.
But and you do not open with the title poem, Inside Every Dream a Raging Sea. Can you talk a little bit about that poem? Because that's
Oh,
placed about, is it three
yeah.
quarters of the way through?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I find the deeper you get into the book, I think there's a different kind of spiritual experience that starts to happen
Okay.
with those later poems. But I had gone to Glastonbury in England in late 2018. So it was that was actually the last trip I took by myself before COVID and everything.
Yeah.
And uh, and I went there and I don't know if you've been to Glastonbury. It's a really magical place. Most people know it because of the Glastonbury Music Festival, but the rest of the year it's a small town surrounded by farmers' fields. And it has one high street, and the high street is mostly occult stores and old bookstores.
Wow.
And yeah, and there are these sacred sites you can go to. The Tours one, there's a couple of wells there. It's considered that the water in the wells has some kind of healing property. Don't know. I don't know if it actually does, but
Yeah.
it's cool to be there. And I gone to Glastonbury, and for me, I most of my ancestry is English and Irish. And so when I'm in places like that, I'm thinking, who walked these lands before? And also connecting to a place that's so different from Canada in that there's so much history there. And we're still developing a lot of that here in terms of understanding, really having an understanding of the land we're on and the stories that are here, right? And so, so that's where that poem came from, is just from being in a different place, and being in a place that has such a sense of place,
Oh,
right?
cool.
Yeah, where, that's more so still so connected to nature. Whereas here, when you're living in Canadian cities, there are big disconnects in many ways happening here,
Yeah.
right? With
Yeah.
the land and with the culture and the history here, and we have a lot of gaps to fill there. Mhm.
So I'm curious then about the image for the cover, which seems
Mhm.
to have a connection to the past, maybe a connection to loss, which is, I guess, one of the themes that runs throughout this book. Is it's a black and white photo,
Mhm.
and of a hand, and I'm not sure the background does look naturish in some ways,
Mhm.
and it looks like, is that a cow skull? What is
I think it's a deer
a
skull.
deer skull? Okay.
Yeah, I would guess that it is. Yeah, yeah.
And so, how did that come about? Was that something you worked with the editors, the publishers on? Was that an image you had in mind?
Yeah, I mean, I was asked for some different reference images, and that was one that I sent, and one that we all felt worked. So yeah,
Awesome.
yeah.
I love that collaborative process, especially with a more dynamic publisher
Hmm.
like BookHug. There's probably more say that the author has in the cover rather than, okay, the Random House editor in New York or whatever designer gave you this and this is what you're getting.
Hmm.
So
Yes, it was a collaborative process in that
yeah.
way.
Okay,
Yes,
cool.
yeah.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, so some of the themes we mentioned the theme of loss. That's a recurring thing in the collection, but there's also I guess what are described as uncomfortable truths
Hmm.
about loss, about age, about
Hmm.
regret, and maybe even about changing identity. Can you talk a little
Mm.
bit about those themes? Or I mean, it's
Yeah.
hard to talk vaguely. You can talk about specific poems.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are things that I'm always exploring in my writing, especially poetry, but I think these are also things that we just explore as people, right? Time passes, and that's a scary thing. It brings up a lot of feelings of uncertainty. I think that's why our society is so obsessed with aging or anti-aging,
Right, right, yeah.
right? We want to stay young. We want to think that life is going to go on forever. And when it comes to sometimes dealing with things like grief and loss and bereavement, there's still so many blocks in our conversations around those things too, and the way people react to them. And a lot of the work I've done as a tarot reader, and also before that, I worked in the nonprofit industry. Working in the last role I had was in youth mental health, and so I'm always very aware of the reality of people's problems because of these jobs that I've been in.
Yeah.
But then I also see the disconnect that so many of us have when it comes to understanding what those problems are or how to talk about them, and also how to deal with our own things,
Mm.
right? So yeah, so I'm always asking these questions, no matter what it is that I'm writing. Because these are our daily things. It's scary to be a human.
Yeah,
You don't know what's going to happen down the road, right? And
that
we're
is
all,
true.
we're
Yeah.
all looking for certainty. We all want to find the fountain of youth. We want to know that we're going to be okay when we get older. We don't know though. And
Right.
unfortunately, we will have challenges at some point. if we
Yeah.
haven't encountered them already.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Now, speaking of the futures, a couple things we probably know. We know that this book is coming out October 22nd, 2024. So October 2024, the book is coming out from Book Hug Press. What's next for you? Have you already started working on other projects, or do you take that after you get through that whole book launch?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'd love to try to take a break from things, but I find, for me, I also like to keep the momentum going with writing. So I'm always trying to work on other things, right? Right now I'm working on another novel. Hopefully, hopefully I'll be able to finish it. I'm doing a revision right now, which basically means I'm just writing the whole thing over again.
Right.
That's usually what that looks like for me, but I'm hoping that I'll be able to have that done within the next year or so. And in terms of poetry, I'm always writing things on the side,
Yeah.
and I at some point either I'll pull it all into a collection or try to find some focus around it and turn it into something that is cohesive and that might be more of a conceptual project. I never know. Like I said, I just kind of let things show me where they want to go.
Cool. Cool.
Mhm.
All right. So for anyone who's listening to this who's always wanted maybe to try poetry but has never written poetry, would there be any advice that you as an experienced and well-published poet, any advice you would offer them to kind of get their feet wet?
I would say, I think it's like anything else. Practice helps.
Okay.
Yeah, I think, if you want to write poetry, start writing. Don't wait. Don't wait for the inspiration to hit you. Just start understanding the type of poetry you want to write. There's so many forms within the genre of poetry. It's not all just one thing. So start to think about what kind of voice you want to have, what kind of poetry you are attracted to. If you don't write poetry, it really helps to if you don't read poetry, it helps to start with that too, because you want to understand the context of what you're working within and the forms that are already out there and what other poets are doing with language. So I think, if you can just get going with something, doesn't matter, it doesn't have to be perfect right away. When I was in high school, I was writing poems about vampires. They're very cheesy and silly when I read back on them now, but that was my starting point that gave me a foundation to work from. And so when I look back, I can also see how far I've come as a writer. And that's, I think, the best way to think about any kind of writing is that where you start isn't going to be where you end up. If you expect to be perfect right away, I mean, maybe some people are perfect right away, but I find most of us need some practice and some polish and some finessing as we go along. And also if you start now, then you'll change as a person as time goes on.
Right.
And that impacts what you're writing and the style that you're working within too. And so you have to give yourself the chance just to be in practice with it.
Cool. Well, thank you for that. And so where can my listeners find you online? Where can they find out more about your new book of poetry and
Mhm.
your other books, of course?
Yeah, thank you. So people can visit my website, which is lizworthauthor.com. And I'm on Instagram at Lizworth Tarot as well. The book is put out through Book Hug Press, so you can go to their website if you want a copy. That's a great place to buy it, especially if you're in Canada. But of course, it's also available through the usual suspects and usual outlets too.
Awesome. And if people are hearing this early enough, like listening to it close to when it's live, are they going to be able to catch you at any in-person events coming up in the next little while?
Yeah, if they're around Hamilton, they can come to the launch party at the Casbah on October 24th. And then there's also an event in Toronto on November 4th, which is at Houndstooth I think that's on College Street.
Oh,
Google it first.
awesome. Well, we'll have links to that in the show notes at starkreflections.ca, as well as your website and the various sites you've mentioned. Liz, I want to thank you again so much for hanging out with me today.
Yeah, thank you.
So, just a couple things I want to reflect on based on this conversation with Liz is she had mentioned how when you're not trying to force it, things can seem to come to you. And then Liz was talking about going for a walk at that point and going for a walk. And then that's when those ideas resonated with her. And then she'd get home and make a note of those. And it's so funny how that's how a lot of our writing happens. A lot of our writing doesn't necessarily, I mean, yes, of course it happens when your fingers on keyboard, or like my friend Kevin Anderson, when you're dictating. And I just did an interview with him for Self-Publishing Insiders with Draft to Digital. And it was so funny because Kevin he broke his ankle 12 weeks ago, and he hikes in the mountains, mostly of Colorado, and that's how he writes. He hikes, and he looks at the beautiful scenery, and he dictates, and that's how he writes. So when he had broken his foot, he had to go sit outside on the deck looking at the mountains from his backyard, because he lives in a beautiful, in a mountainous area outside of Colorado Springs. But that wasn't the same. It wasn't the same as moving through the woods and stuff like that. So it's kind of interesting how I think what Kevin's doing is merging those elements together. Like Liz talks about going for a walk and you see different things and experience and feel and smell, all the things that are happening to you, and that can inspire and prompt stuff. And I guess that's been his routine, right? I'm going to move through the woods and stuff like that, and that's how I'm going to work. So just sitting there didn't have the same effect on him. So it's interesting how it's this element of going and doing other things. I know, for example, when I'm shoveling, when I'm driving, and I'm not listening to, or sometimes when I'm listening to an audiobook or a podcast, I will pause it and make notes. Sometimes I just do auto dictation and just save an audio note on my phone so I can get back to it later in case I don't forget it. Sometimes I'll ask as I'm driving with the hands free. I'll text myself or email myself some notes and just have the Google dictate it. And that's kind of an interesting thing, because a lot of the writing, a lot of those things are inputs from our world that we process, and Liz talked about this in a different element of the interview, that the way that people interpret things, they're bringing their own filters to it. And so that's what we're doing as writers, is we're incorporating elements from all around us, applying those filters. And it's just a reminder that if you're struggling as a writer, and you're having trouble getting some things out, go and do something different. Use a different part of your mind. And sometimes for me, it's the physical activity that allows me to change that mindset and just trigger something different in my brain. And maybe that can work for you. So give that a shot sometimes if you're struggling with a piece of writing. Or if you're struggling with trying to write a scene in prose, let's say it's a conflict scene between two of the characters where something needs to happen. Let's say you're having trouble writing that scene. A couple things you can do is try and twist the scene for a different perspective from the other character's perspective, and that might break that sort of hold or that block that you have. Another thing to potentially do is, okay, let's think about, we're talking about poetry here. Don't write it as prose, as dialogue. Write it as poetry, maybe from the perspective of one character, and then write another quick poetry from the other. Just trying that different element, that different exercise. When you're not trying to force the actual, okay, I need to write this dialogue scene or this tension scene. Trying to do it in some other way could spark a different part of your brain. And that could help you. Just a thought. Let me know if you've tried that, if that's something that works for you, if you've done it in the past or you've tried it after listening to that. Love to hear about that. And the second thing I want to reflect on is Liz talking about horror-adjacent poetry. And it was so interesting with my own experience with poetry and horror and dark humor. And again, because, as I mentioned in the interview, I was going back into my poems and looking at stuff I'd published, and there was some stuff I'd published that wasn't horror, and just like in the stories I didn't include in One Hand Screaming 20 Haunting Years, it was like, I love this story, it's great, but it's not horror enough because this is meant to be a horror themed collection. And there's a poem I'm really proud of. It was published in a Hamilton literary journal. And Liz from Hamilton, Ontario. I used to live in Hamilton, and it was, very literary in mind, but it was based somewhat on a personal experience as well. And so it was like a lot of reflecting. I'm also working with one of my client authors, working on a book of poetry that she has written about a very unique experience in her own life where she separated from her husband of a few decades. And it was just this experience of an intense experience of a passionate night with someone she had just met, but it was kind of like she needed to exercise some of the new freedoms that she suddenly had, and also needed to kind of get rid of some stuff. And as I'm helping her with the publishing of this book, she's doing it herself, but I'm walking her through the process, of course, reading it and looking at formatting and stuff with her. And it's just so amazing that, I mean, I've always found poetry to be very therapeutic, right? Is a great way. I've always thought of it as painting pictures with your mind, like painting pictures with words, I should say. And for me, poetry, a lot of it can just be, okay, here's this image I want you to see, or here are these feelings I've adapted into some other element. And doing that with horror is so interesting because it allows me to play upon those emotions and fears and anxieties and all those things. And there's so many different ways you can approach it, because unlike traditional prose, you can do a lot more experimentation. And what I've gotten out of re-listening to this interview with Liz is my desire to just play again, to just have some fun and experiment. And again, not everything I write's going to be something that's worthwhile for other people to read, but sometimes that experiment can lead to those triggers. And I use this in the teaser episode at the beginning, where Liz talks about sometimes the piece itself has a life of its own, and sometimes just playing in that, for me anyways, just playing in that can speak to something else. So writing this as a poem could go, oh, there's a piece of dialogue I'm now going to incorporate into this other element that has nothing to do with this poem, but that element or that piece or that phrase is something that spoke to me and reminded me of something else. Anyways, I love that experimentation. And again, just talking to Liz has inspired me to want to go and check that out. Again, if you've not written poetry before, Liz offered some great advice. Did that inspire you to want to try poetry out? Did you go and check out? Did you go and read poetry? Potentially Liz's awesome new book, which is quite amazing. I'd love to hear that. I'd love to hear your thoughts and your own reflections for anything from episodes. And you can leave them over at starkreflections.ca. You can tag me on the social medias. You can also leave comments over at YouTube, etc., where this podcast, the audio feed, is automatically ported to. But as always, I am so grateful that you are here listening to these episodes. I am so grateful that I've managed to not miss a week in 7 years of these Fridays, despite how insane and unorganized, my schedule can be, and how completely disorganized I am and continue to be. But thanks for coming back every week. It's great to have you there, and I will be back next week with a new episode. So until next week, and until next episode, this is, as always, Mark Leslie Lefebvre wishing you, dear writer, great writing and good Stark Reflections.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com.